So we're reading Edgar Allan Poe, right? And he has Gothic elements in his literature, which we should know by now. However, his literature is still not Gothic literature. It's Romantic literature, as in American Romanticism, right? But it has Gothic elements in it. So what I want to do today is talk about the development from classical literature to today, that we're talking about today with American Romanticism, Romantic literature, and kind of to see the development and how it got where it is today. So what I'm using now is a handbook to literature. This is a compilation of a bunch of words and what those words mean and where they come from. So it's kind of like a dictionary, but more has to do with, it's more like an encyclopedia of literary terms rather than just everything. So, okay? All right. Caleb's probably going to want to take notes. Okay? So let me start by reading what this entry for Gothic. Okay, what does the word Gothic mean? Not just as in a type of novel or something, but as in an adjective. What is the word Gothic and where does it come from? Gothic comes from the term originally comes from the group of a Germanic tribe called the Goths. Okay, so although the Goths were a single Germanic tribe of ancient and medieval times, so they were of ancient in Britannia and medieval times as well, the meaning of Gothic was broadened to mean Teutonic or Germanic, and later medieval in general. So originally the Goths were one tribe in the Germanic area, okay, and it became a term used and applied to that area in general, and then later on it became a term applied to the medieval time period. So it really began to broaden its use. In architecture, Gothic, although it may mean any style that's not classic, so in one sense Gothic is kind of an antonym to classic, Gothic versus classic. So although it may mean any style not classic, in architecture it's more specifically applied to the style that succeeded the Romanesque in Western Europe, flourishing from the 12th century to the 16th century. So it's a broad term, but specifically in architecture it can also mean referring to the type of architecture that became popular in the 16th and 17th century. That's what it said, right? No, I'm sorry. 12th through the 16th century in architecture that came about after the Romanesque architecture. It's marked by the pointed arch and vault, vertical effects suggesting aspiration, stained windows for mystery, and slender spires, flying buttresses, intricate traceries, wealth and a variety of detail, and flexibility of spirit. So it has a lot to do with this natural, it has a lot to do with nature. It has these pointed archways, right? So like when you think of a church, an archway that doesn't just arch like this, right, comes to an archway, but the pointed arch that comes to a spear point at the top, right? That's very Gothic. Anything that's like looking up, so you'll see it in movies, which we'll talk about. Now, moving on from that and applied to literature specifically, this is where it becomes an antonym to classic, the adjective classic. Applied to literature, the term was used by the 18th century neoclassicists, so classicists, but they are new classicists, as synonymous with barbaric. So the neoclassicists, those who supported the idea of the classics in the 18th century, so that's 1700s, the people who supported the classics said that Gothic was barbaric. Okay, so that means it's just undignified, it's not good, things like that. Addison said that artists who were unable to achieve the classic graces of simplicity, dignity, and unity resorted to the use of foreign ornaments. Quote, all the extravagances of an irregular fancy, unquote. And then here we have another term that should be key. The Romanticists of the next generation. So Romanticists followed the Neoclassicists. The Romanticists of the next generation, however, looked with favor on the Gothic. Why? The Neoclassicists said Gothic is barbaric and said we should do art that follows these kinds of ideas: simplicity, dignity, unity. Why would the Romanticists say we like Gothic when the Neoclassicists say they don't for those reasons?
Like simple stuff.
Simple in what way? What do you mean by simple?
Like simple values such as importance, past, nature, stuff like that.
Yeah, nature. Good. So they definitely, the Romanticists definitely liked the Gothic style of everything because it got back to nature. And that was exactly why the Neoclassicists didn't like it. The Neoclassicists said that nature is barbaric, that nature is unkempt, right? And in large part, it was a religious motivation of saying that nature is affected by sin, and so therefore it's wild and untamed. And we should aspire to things that are dignified, unified, things like that. And nature is too wild, it's too barbaric. And that's exactly why the Romanticists liked Gothic style. To the Romanticists, Gothic suggested whatever was medieval, natural, primitive, wild, free, authentic, romantic. Listen to those words again and think about how you have seen things described in the books and stuff that we've read that's romantic. That matches with these words: medieval, natural, primitive, wild, free, authentic, romantic. Can you think of anything that matches really well with those words in what we've read that's romance? Even some of those same words are used to describe some things. Like what? Edgar Allan Poe? Okay, what specifically in Edgar Allan Poe would you say is an example of this?
I guess the Raven kind of shows it, where it's like...
What does?
I guess the Raven kind of shows it.
The Raven? Okay, good. The Raven. What else? Okay, what about the wine cellar?
That's very wild and
Yeah. Okay, good. Very primitive. When I think of a wine cellar and a dungeon, which is what it ended up being, I think of the word primitive and definitely medieval.
more of a medieval thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then also just they're kind of like the festival, and it seemed like it was an older festival.
Right. Good. So the whole scene was very medieval. What else? What about in Emerson or Thoreau? We haven't read them yet, but anything at all that you can think of? Okay.
I think they both. I think from what I've done, I've done a little bit of research on them, so I know that they also tend to have those values.
Okay. Good. Like what? What makes you say that?
Thoreau, I believe he was very much inspired by Poe.
Inspired by Emerson.
And
Yeah.
Emerson was inspired by Poe, I believe.
They were all kind of together, yeah.
Okay.
Good. What about Hawthorne? Any character that is praised for being some of these things?
That was like a lion try.
Exactly. Those are the two keywords I was thinking. Pearl and wild. Wild and free, right? What a lot of people say today, like you might hear it as a complaint for like Instagram people, when they're like, that's fake. It's I like when they take a picture of their dirty laundry and they're like, this is authentic. This is me. I'm just being genuine, right? That's wild and free and genuine. It's that same idea. So those are some examples of how the Romanticists appreciated the Gothic for those reasons. Indeed, they praised such writers as Shakespeare and Spenser, which a lot of people praise. People who are not Romanticists praise Shakespeare and Spenser. But why do the Romanticists praise Shakespeare and Spenser? It's because of their Gothic elements. Variety, richness, mystery, aspiration. Have you guys read the Red Cross Knight? That's really famous. It's from Spenser's Fairy Queen. Yeah, it's very medieval, knights in shining armor, killing the dragon and saving the damsel kind of thing, which is very romantic and very Gothic. So going on. Later, vigorous celebrators of the Gothic were Ruskin, Pater, Henry Adams. The comic books and movies devoted to Batman emphasize the pointed arches and vertical movement in dark spaces. So, for one, it's a very dark environment, Batman is, right? It's all of the scenes are dark, almost the whole movie. And then when you think about like the archways, right? Like there's a lot of pointed archways in the Batman castles and in his mansion. And then also even the shots that they make. A lot of times the camera is below, so Batman comes on the scene and he's like standing up and the shot is like this, pointing up at him, right? So it makes him look tall and inspiring and dark. So very, very Gothic. And even, let me keep reading the name too. The comic books and movies devoted to Batman emphasize pointed arches and vertical movement in dark spaces. The 1989 movie ends in a Gothic cathedral in the aptly named Gotham City. So that's where the name Gotham City comes from. Joyce Carol Oates called Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian a Gothic Western. All right. So now that's the general term Gothic and how it applies to different areas like architecture, even movies now, but literature and romanticism. Do you guys see the connection then from classicists who appreciated simplicity, unity, and dignity, and then the romanticists kind of rebelled against the neoclassicists and said, we want things to be wild and free because that's natural, and natural is the way that we should be, trying to get back to Eden, right? All of that is fighting against the neoclassicists and praising the Gothic when the classicists said, no, Gothic is barbaric. Do you guys see that development? Okay. So now let's talk about the Gothic novel. A novel in which magic, mystery, and chivalry are the chief characteristics. So when we say a novel is a Gothic novel, then we're talking about something specific now, okay? And this is where Edgar Allan Poe takes Gothic elements, but it's not a Gothic short story or Gothic novel. It's a romantic or a romance rather than a Gothic. Okay? So, a novel in which magic, mystery, and chivalry are the chief characteristics. Horrors abound. One may expect a suit of armor suddenly to come to life among the ghosts, clanking chains and charnel houses. Although anticipations of the Gothic novel appear in Smollett, especially in Ferdinand Count Fathom, Horace Walpole was the real originator. Its setting is a medieval castle with long underground passages. So when you think long underground passage, think dark for one, and then think tall archways, right? They're both long. Whether it's long straight ahead or long up above, it's these tall, elongated areas and architecture. long underground passages, trap doors, dark stairways, mysterious rooms whose doors slam unexpectedly. William Beckford's Vathek, an Arabian tale, added the element of the oriental luxury and magnificence to the species. So this is why I want to talk about this in the context of Edgar Allan Poe, because Edgar Allan Poe was a romance, right? He took the nature and talked about it in the way that that Ralph Waldo Emerson praised nature. So, for example, Hawthorne too, and Poe, they each talked about problems that we all experience, right? The difference is that Hawthorne provided a solution, which we recognize as the wrong solution. He said that the solution is the heart. Follow your heart, basically. And Poe talks about the same problems, but I think because of his horrible life and how dark it was, he doesn't really provide the same kind of solution. And maybe sometimes, I haven't come across it though. I get the sense that he's just very pessimistic. Poe talks about the same problems, death, murder, anger, revenge, that Hawthorne talked about in The Scarlet Letter. Same themes, except that Poe is kind of like, well, the bad guy wins. He just kind of gives up. Where Hawthorne says, no, there's a redeeming element. Pearl, at the end, becomes the person she's meant to be in spite of all this trouble that they experienced. Poe's story is more like, I've experienced all this trouble and I'm depressed. And that's it. That's the end. So they're very different in their ending. But Poe, nonetheless, is very much a romance, because what he writes is romance, because it's talking about those same issues in the same way. However, because it's dark, he takes in these Gothic elements. So what he's doing is he's melding together these different genres. Okay, and that's because that happens naturally. So when Gothic was becoming a substantial, recognized element in literature, they started to take in elements from other areas too, like the Oriental aspect. So it says here, William Beckford's Vathek, an Arabian tale, added the element of Oriental luxury and magnificence to the species. So now Gothic is not so much Germanic, but it's dark and mysterious and medieval. And now we're adding in the Oriental aspect of being mysterious and extravagant gold lining, and they're starting to change the genre by adding influences from other cultures, but it's still very Gothic. And that's what Poe does too later on with different elements. And that's what we see today as well. So when we talk about, for example, science fiction versus fantasy, okay? Fantasy, classic fantasy, is very, very settled as to what it is. It's some of the same characteristics, but not always dark, right, as Gothic. So Gothic, it says, chief characteristics were magic, mystery, and chivalry. So those are very, very key elements in classic fantasy, except that more often than not, the classic fantasy is not so dark like Gothic literature is. So classic fantasy, though, has started to change as well. So when I think classic fantasy, you would think like Lord of the Rings, because that's magic, chivalry, a lot of chivalry, definitely magic, and adventure. But there's no explanation for how the magic works. Like Gandalf has a staff and then he gets an upgrade, but there's no science behind how his staff works. He taps it in Mordor, or in the Mines of Moria. He taps it on the ground and a light shows up. How is it powered? It's by magic. Right, but what makes the magic work? Well, you don't know that. It's just magic. It just does work. That's like not scientific, right? So in one end of the spectrum, we have this classic fantasy where things happen by magic, but no explanation for how it works. So that makes it unrealistic, which is why they liked the fantasy. It was unrealistic. It was imaginative. On the other end of the spectrum, we have science fiction, which says we should never write anything unless we know how it works, right? And so they write things like Ender's Game, where they're in the future, and they have science, and they have science fiction authors are proposing imaginative ideas that science could possibly make, like this immediate communication, where they splice an atom, and then the atom reacts to itself. Whatever happens to one side happens to the other side, no matter how far apart they are. So they use that to communicate light years apart from each other with immediate communication, right? So he's providing ideas that, with the hopes that scientists could take these ideas and actually make something of them. That's the other end of the spectrum, right? Now we've got literature that is mixing those two ends, which are very much opposites. So, for example, this one, Brandon Sanderson's The Way of Kings. It's very, very magical, very chivalrous, very mystery oriented. It's definitely an entirely different world where there's things that happen, but he uses the principles of science, like the second law of thermodynamics and things like that, and he applies it to a world that has magic. And so he starts to create a system where magic is actually run by laws, and you can use it to do things, and it's taking both ends of the spectrum and putting it into a single book. So that's what is happening with the Gothic literature. Poe is taking Romantic literature, he's taking Gothic literature, and he's putting them into one in order to create something new. And that's part of why Poe is so memorable. When you read his stuff, it's so flowery, but it's so dark, and that's not what you expect. Like, you don't always expect that when you read other romance novels. So, okay, any questions on the development of literature from classicist to Gothic to neoclassicist to romance? Okay, all right.